All right, well, welcome, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on storytelling and eating disorders. This discussion is part of the Marginalized Voices Project, brought to you by the National Eating Disorders Association and Reasons Eating Disorder Center. In this discussion, we'll be exploring the role that storytelling plays in eating disorder awareness and recovery, and how both clinicians and those who are personally affected can use storytelling as a tool for recovery. I'm Allison Carter, and I'm excited to be leading today's discussion. I am a writer working in poetry and hybrid forms, and also a social worker. And I've developed creative writing groups for adults and adolescents in a variety of educational and mental health settings. For the last 5 years, I've been leading creative writing groups and training other clinicians to lead creative writing groups at Reasons Eating Disorder Center in Pasadena. So I'd like to just start by taking a few moments to have our panelists introduce themselves and share a bit of their own stories with you. So I guess, Jayden, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jayden. Jayden Fields. I'm a Black trans man, a part of TFED, Trans Folks Fighting Eating Disorders. I'm also a writer, and I definitely believe in the power of storytelling as a form of healing. So I do a lot of local writing workshops and using writing as a tool for communities that don't usually have access to those kind of things to start to work through what healing looks like for them. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Pia, how about you? Oh, Pia, I think your microphone's off.
Thank you. My name is Pia Guerrero, and I'm the founder and editor of Adios Barbie. And we started about over 10 years ago, and it was really a place to tell stories for folks with marginalized identities who suffer from body image issues or eating disorders to talk about their experiences that weren't in the mainstream. My background's also in doing digital storytelling with marginalized youth and creative writing, teaching creative writing, and really I'm really committed to storytelling as a form of healing and actually awareness raising as part of activism.
All right, thank you. And Gloria, how about you?
I started Nalgona Positivity Pride as a way to highlight the voices that are constantly left out in the eating disorder and body positive world. And I started it because I never felt that I could see people like myself. Well, I never did saw people like myself talking about eating disorders in our own communities. So really it was a desperate act in a way to really showcase us and our unique struggles with food and our bodies.
Okay, thank you. And Malin, how about you?
Hi, so I'm a clinical psychologist and I started working with Latinos when I was in Puerto Rico. And 8 years ago, I moved to North Carolina working with Latinos living in the United States. So basically, I am adapting eating disorder treatment for Latinos and trying to develop culturally sensitive, not only treatment, but also educative materials and prevention with Latino population.
Okay, great. So we have an incredible group of people with incredible resources here. So let's move on to talking about storytelling and how we're all using it. Storytelling has long been a powerful tool for sharing experiences, bridging gaps, and strengthening cultural bonds. It can have a particular impact in marginalized groups in which stories being shared are not necessarily represented in the dominant narrative, as we're hearing in your stories already, as well as among those with eating disorders, because eating disorders thrive in secrecy. So, Gloria, I'd like to start by asking you, what are some different ways that we share our stories? And could you expand on the importance of storytelling in marginalized communities?
I think it's important to recognize that storytelling that attributes to change and healing is when it's honest and coming from a place of being vulnerable. And there's different ways that we share our stories depending on what community you are on. Some people do it through video, art, writing, sometimes by mutual support within our own circles. Also, social media, I think, within the last few years has become a big platform for people, particularly people in marginalized communities. And I also want to include zines, which is your own self-publishing. I think has become a alternative way to make sharing our writing more accessible. Um, and it's so important uh, to really share our stories because in our communities, particularly indigenous communities, that was uh, one of the only ways to really share our history, our culture, and yet for today, due to the mental health stigma, it has been difficult for people in marginalized communities to talk openly about our struggles, and um, and it's impossible to create awareness or to treat something if we don't even have the language to talk about it, right? So I feel like there's two messages going on, particularly with people who are of indigenous descent, is that yes, storytelling is a big part of our identity and who we are, due to the fact that a lot of our written and physical records were destroyed through colonialism, right? So there is a lot of power with storytelling, but due to current stigma, it makes it difficult to be very honest and open about mental health.
And I think I hear you saying two things. One, there's sort of this idea of sharing the story, making sure that the history gets told and gets heard. And then on the other hand, even creating language for talking about things in the first place. And I guess I'm wondering if anyone else has any thoughts on that before we move on here. Oh, Pia, your microphone again.
I can speak to my own experience. You know, usually eating disorders and other forms of mental health issues, they don't necessarily just pop up. You know, they come up. They don't thrive in a vacuum. And often, my experience has been that my family had mental health issues, and so when you're living in a space where reality is sort of augmented by mental health issues in your family, to actually put your experience on paper or to put it on the computer or to put it on a video actually makes something real. And so when you're telling your story, it makes it real, and it's not left to manipulation or gaslighting or other things that can happen, you know, when you are trying to share your experience with family or even friends that don't understand. And so it's a really important process, I believe, to actually, even if it's just starting with a journal that the only person's going to read is yourself, it's recreating a reality for yourself and naming your story. And then that really is, you know, powerful. I think partially too, what we have to look at who owns the media and who owns getting our stories out there to a larger audience, because right now it's owned predominantly by white, or you know, the dominant culture, and the stories are around white cis individuals. And so the stereotype for someone with an eating disorder is a white middle class woman and or girl, and usually there's, even back from when I was growing up, the after school specials about, you know, a girl with an eating disorder. And so it's also adding to that narrative, because there is a singular narrative out there. And so I think when we put our stories out there and realize that someone else comments on our stories and says, wow, I felt that too, or it resonates with the larger audience, that brings the whole experience full circle and builds community that we might not find within our own families or within our own communities due to stigma, which is what Gloria was talking about.
And I want to add on about the language barrier that exists, particularly for people who are bilingual. Like, for instance, my parents speak Spanish, right? And the word eating disorder is translated in Spanish as trastornos alimenticios. And I mean, nobody talks like that. I mean, it's language that is heavily medicalized. And so there is this barrier within talking about our own bodies, our feelings around food. Right? And it seems like the only accessible language to talk about our feelings about food is in shaming connotations. So there's a lot of barriers when it comes to storytelling for some communities, and I think we need to be mindful about that.
I also wanted to add, when I think about like storytelling in the Black community, there was a rich history of that, and then with slavery, there was a lot of silencing of things, and families, when it comes to mental health, that stigma is so heavy there, and so there's this like silencing of that. You can't talk about the bad things because you have to put on a face and be good enough for society. I was recently having a conversation with some other Black folks about mental health in the Black community, and we were talking about the recent, all of the recent police brutality, and a common theme that was coming up was, I don't have time, or I don't have the space to really like break down about this because I have to keep going. I have to keep going. A lot of us are being told from a very young age that, in order to even make it in society, we have to be like twice as good, 3 times as good. And so when there's also mental health issues coming up, which usually do, even if it's just like because of society, there isn't the space or time to dive into that. So it can be really extremely powerful to even begin to tell your story and to begin to like take time to do that.
Something that happened to me when I came here to North Carolina is that many patient Latinas, they found that it was so hard for them to share what's going on with them in terms of the eating disorder, because they said that most of the time talking about their symptoms here was like not finding anyone like them and Latinas dealing with the same issue. So I think that was very important, especially the experience here in North Carolina. As soon we start talking about this is something that happened to Latinas and also to Latino males, then they start talking more about their symptoms and sharing their story, not only with physicians, but among other Latinas also. So I think that eventually they find some voice about this is something that happening to us too.
So I'd like to ask, we're talking about how crucial it is to have these stories sort of disseminating to be even able to connect on a person-to-person basis. This idea of I've had this experience, so I have too. Can we find a communal language to start to talk about this in a way that actually matches my experience? And so I want to ask, in that process, have you encountered, real concrete difficulties finding spaces, finding platforms through which to share your stories? Thinking that we are looking at a media that is dominated by, like you said, sort of like white, cis, males and females too.
I think that we assume that everybody has access to internet, and so we can just jump in and get our stories and get our stories out there, but then also read stories as well. But I think that's not necessarily the case. And so I think it's interesting to me that some groups that are actually doing a lot of great work are churches, and trying to provide services for their parishioners. But to look at where people are and to bring the resources there. But yeah, I think there does need to be something around not assuming that everybody's on the internet. Yes, a lot of people are, but a lot of people aren't. And younger people are, but maybe the parents aren't. So that's part of one of the barriers is those assumptions around accessibility. And accessibility to, if we want more films or we want more books made by marginalized folks sharing their experiences with mental health or eating disorders, there's definitely difficulty to accessing those, I would say, power brokers to get the stories out there in a wider way to actually change our culture so that we're not so stigmatized.
And I wanted to add, as somebody who has been active with, for instance, Overeaters Anonymous, I was usually the youngest person and the only person of color. So in a lot of meetings, and I mean, I'm talking about going to meetings here in Los Angeles and further south, but I mean, not being able to see yourself in those meetings made it very difficult for me to want to share or feel uncomfortable when sharing, because I know I speak with an accent and they're looking at me kind of funny or whatnot. So it was very difficult to be in these spaces and to want to share my stories with this free support group. So one of the things that Positivity Pride tried to focus on is in creating a support group that's specifically for people of color with eating problems. And currently we are transitioning that group to be online so that it can be accessible not only to people in LA, Los Angeles, but throughout the country, and making it accessible to people with disabilities who might not have easy access to move around and so forth. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the only effort to make an official eating disorder support group. And I think that's very unfortunate because there needs to be more creation of these spaces that are made only for that, because then it motivates people to share their stories.
Yeah, I agree. So often, and when I would try to find spaces, I was the only black person in a room full of older white, and it was really just difficult to be that token in a space that's supposed to be vulnerable. And so, like with TFED, we have a support group that's closed to trans people, because I think it's really important and that folks in marginalized communities are creating spaces that are closed for these communities, because there's certain experiences that only folks who've gone through these things can understand, and the ways that your identities interact with your eating disorder. And so I think it's really important that folks are trying to create closed spaces for marginalized communities, because it's really hard to find that otherwise.
I think also, in my experience, I was never officially diagnosed with an eating disorder because I was considered someone who, how could you have an eating disorder? Being chronically ill and having basically fighting for my life due to lupus. I was dying in the hospital because of that, but I also had an eating disorder, and nobody could ever think that those two things could happen at the same time. That someone would be, I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen, that you have intersectional identities that do suffer from eating disorders. We might not think, oh, a person with a disability can have an eating disorder. So I haven't even found a group of folks with chronic illness who have disordered eating. And I only found it afterwards, after finding other people who have had eating disorders say to me, no, you had an eating disorder. And so I think that there's so much more awareness to be had. And also, it's considered, you know, if you have an eating disorder that makes you thin, that's sort of celebrated. Oh, you've lost so much weight. That's so great. So I think that that's, you know, we just have so much more education and awareness to raise about who does get an eating disorder and how to support marginalized folks in their struggles.
And so it seems like we're hitting on these themes of dissemination and education on the one hand, creating awareness so that people know, yes, like you can have illness and look a certain way and still have an eating disorder. And then on the other hand, once that awareness is present, to be able to create these closed, safe spaces, so that people feel that they can, use their voice and share their story in a way where it's going to be safe, and also where it's going to be heard, where there's the possibility to start co-creating language that again is going to sort of make sense. And I think what I'm also hearing is that when this isn't possible, what we find is secrecy. That might be a product of the way sort of the culture is working. But I think we all, one thing that we know is that eating disorders do thrive in secrecy. And so I wanted to ask a little bit more about that. And, Jayden, I'd like to start with you. I'm wondering if you could sort of speak a little more about the power of silence and secrecy in eating disorders.
Yeah, I feel like these behaviors, they cause so much shame. There's so much shame and feeling this way and feeling a little bit crazy, and I feel like a lot of eating disorder behavior can make folks feel a little bit crazy, and so there's so much shame. And then on top of that, the stigma around being able to talk about these feelings, just it just creates these spaces of silence, which then propels the behaviors. If you can't talk about it, then how are you going to ever start to heal from it? If you can't start to tell your story, it feels like maybe you don't really have a story to tell, or maybe you don't have a story worth telling, and maybe you aren't worth it, and healing isn't something that you can attain. And so, yeah, silence and the shame around things really can just continue to propel these behaviors.
And then I guess I want to ask, and Pia, I'll ask you this question. And we've touched on this a little bit, but again, sort of thinking about this idea of secrecy, and the idea of sort of co-creating language and being able to talk about it. As we said, there are cultural perceptions around issues of mental health being taboo in communities of color, as well as those who believe that people of color are somehow not affected by mental health struggles. And again, I know you've already mentioned this a little bit. Have you encountered this mindset? And can you tell us a little bit about what that's been like?
Yeah, I'm bicultural. So my father's Mexican, and my entire family lives in Mexico, and then my mom's family is here in the U.S. And even though my father's educated and has higher degree of education, there's definitely this stigma in Mexico that mental health issues do not exist. They do not exist. And so he'll say to me, we don't have anxiety in Mexico. We don't have anxiety issues in Mexico. And yet he's probably the most nervous person that I know. And I don't know where that comes from, but it's not even that, no, you can't talk about having a mental health issue. It does, it's going to look badly on the family. I mean, that's part of it, of outward appearances, because at least there our family is so big, and then community connections are so big. It's like you don't want to look a certain way. If you have a mental health issue, it looks a certain way. I mean, divorce has even, being hyper-Catholic, divorce has even been only recently normalized there. So there's been a lot of just blatant denial. Well, we don't have that there. We don't have that here. That's an American issue. Right down to, you know, therapy. My sister was saying that she wanted to become an art therapist, and my uncle just started laughing at her like that's just some wild and crazy American thing. Americans are always, you know, doing these outrageous things that are silly. So it's not even a lack of recognition. It's just like that's absurdity. That's absurdity, and so that's been something that's really hard to deal with if you're trying to share your mental health experience with the people you care about, and it's just a non-topic. You just don't talk about it. It's just not something that happens. So that's been my experience.
I guess I'm wondering if anyone else has had similar experiences. You know, Jayden, I know you were talking a little bit about this before, and this idea of like, I need to be able to do twice as much to even sort of be in the world.
Yeah, I can say for like my own family, that was the message that we got. You know, very young, you have to be twice as good as everyone else. Well, really, you have to be twice as good as the white kids to get half as much. And you know, but there was so much mental health issues in my family, like my mother with depression, my brother schizophrenia, me, and all the things that I had going on, and my eating disorder. Just didn't talk about it. We just never talked about it. Even when folks needed to actually access like higher levels of psychiatric care, we still didn't talk about it. And I think, you know, the need to sort of be twice as good was part of it, but also religion. You know, my family is Southern Baptist, and so when things would come up, it was give it to God, just pray about it, just pray on it. And it's like, that's cool if that's part of what you need, but also if someone's got schizophrenia, they also need to be on medication. So we need to have that conversation as well. You know, but it was a lot of just like silencing of things. And when things would come up, it's like, don't talk about it, give it to God. So when it came to trying to tell stories, you know, that or to share, like, hey, I think I might need help with things, or I think I might have an eating disorder. It was like, oh, no. You can't do that. We need to be okay. And if you really need something, just give it to God, which is just so limiting.
I can echo that too, that it's a lot of it is give it to God, or, you know, pray on it, but also I think there's also a lot of self-medicating, at least within my family, where instead of getting mental health support and medication, it's drinking lots of alcohol. And it's almost also, we can solve our problems within our family. We can do that within our family, and don't let people know outside the family. There's a lot of family secrets if somebody has a significant mental health issue, so obviously that's a huge barrier to getting help.
And again, sort of thinking about that idea of secrecy and shame, and how then that feeds into the behaviors, and we find sort of a cycle. And so I want to sort of take that and circle back around to the idea of storytelling, and how crucial that is, and talk a little bit about tools for storytelling. So Malin, you've used storytelling as a tool for raising awareness of eating disorders in the Latino population through the use of photonovellas. I guess I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and share a bit more about how storytelling as a practice and as an art practice can be used to raise awareness, especially among marginalized groups.
Yes. We know that one of the keys that is important in raising awareness is having information out there. However, that information should be culturally appropriate. So one of the way in which we found that could be very culturally appropriate for Latino is using fotonovela, which is a graphic novel, like a soap opera, um, that is so popular for Latino population, and they love fotonovelas. Usually, it has been used for entertainment, so why not use it for education? And has been using for education on depression, also dementia. So we decided to explore how to use fotonovela to raise awareness about eating disorders. So we developed 4 scripts tailored for age and also for sex, and the reception of the fotonovelas in different focus groups that we conducted was amazing. They identify with the character, and was a moment that they say, oh, this is something that is happening to me, and was a way to identify with the story, but not in a personal way, more subtle. So what's very interesting for them to find a way to identify with that, and also trying to follow what can I do if the character look for help, what happened with the character. And of course there is some limitation with fotonovela because we can't portray so many, the variety of issues that we found with eating disorders. So eventually we need to develop many scripts in order to present the complexity of the eating disorder, but at least it's a first step to put out there the information for Latino. We use Spanglish for adolescents because that is the reality. They speak Spanish at home, but they speak English at school. And for adults, we use primarily Spanish because this is the reality for Latino adults who are first generation here. So we're trying to be very conscious about the reality of the Latino living in the United States, and trying to be very sensitive, and trying to portray some of the story that they can feel that this is something that can happen to me, that eating disorder can happen not only to adolescents but also to adults, but also for male in a different way. So I think that is the first start to continue educating Latinos about eating disorder. So we developed the script, and we had to test and see if it is different compared to the traditional brochure that is the reality that we have more available in the United States. I think that they say that they feel more appealing to grab the fotonovela, to read the fotonovela, which is a good step, because you can have all the information in a brochure in a physician office, but if they don't feel appealed to grab the information, to read the information, so it's a barrier. So I think that it's very attractive for them to start reading the novella. So we are hoping that eventually we can use it as a way to continue educating Latinos about eating disorders.
Okay. So, are you guys hearing an echo? No? Okay. I guess, what I'm hearing is that you've really looked into what is what is a form that is already sort of legible and appealing to the group that you're trying to work with here, and then really using that form to create something that's going to be more effective than these sort of mainstream pamphlets that we have in schools and doctors' offices. Gloria, I wanted to ask you to sort of pick up on this. There is this mainstream narrative around eating disorders. We see it in the pamphlets. We see it in the media. And I'm wondering if you could speak also a little bit about how storytelling can increase awareness of the reality and also the diversity of eating disorders.
When messages come from people in your own group, they could really mirror a person. So I truly believe that when a person shares a story, it gives the opportunity for that one person to see themselves. And I mean, we could think of our own stories on how somebody said something and then we say, oh, I thought that was just me, right? So I think about my experience while growing up. What would have happened had, let's say, a speaker were to have come to one of my classes during high school, and that person been of color and talk about eating disorders? I really feel like that would have made an impact, a good impact, in my own struggle with my eating disorder. So I think that it's super important that we have people that mirror us when it comes to speaking about eating disorders and body image. Um, I mean, how are youth of color going to learn to love themselves if the only people that get the platform to talk about body love are white women? I mean, it's and the same goes with the common narrative of only white, young, cisgendered, privileged girls get anorexia, right? Yet the most common eating disorder is binge eating. Um, that kind of leaves our stories behind, and I think that when we don't share our own experiences in our own communities, then it makes our struggles and illnesses invisible and unreal, and then we don't have a way to recognize it when it does happen, and we can't heal what we don't know, right? So it kind of perpetuates this cycle of of struggle. And I truly believe that healing comes from our own community. And um, as long as we start to create our own language and we start to share our narratives, our stories, then we can address it. But until then, we have this overrepresentation of white, middle class, educated people in the fields. It makes it very, for me personally, it causes alienation for me where I don't want to be part of that, or it makes me, well, what it did do, it made me create Nalgona Positivity Pride, right? It made me create my own opportunity and just pretty much try to say and do what I wish I had 10 years ago. And really, like I said, showcase, highlight, and share our own stories.
I'd love
So,
to. Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Well, I wanted to add to that because I have found that when you have people of a certain identity that is not the same as yourself, and they are the clinicians, or they are the teachers, or they are the speakers at the school talking about eating disorders, or even if you engage in treatment, there is just naturally a feeling of being objectified, that you're the subject of research, you're the subject of study, you're the anomaly, and that's probably one of the worst things in terms of healing to feel. And so I think it's really crucial to have some of the leaders of addressing eating disorders with marginalized communities be from the community. It's just so crucial to feel that you are heard and understood, and so much can be unsaid that the person gets. And that, this is a public health crisis in the United States, and this is probably one of the few areas that isn't addressing a whole part of the population, or if it's addressing it, it's limited. And so I just want to really support Gloria's point of how important it is to expand the field so that the people who are out there doing the education and the treatment are coming from communities that are suffering from disorders, eating disorders.
So I guess, what I'd like to ask is, it seems like several of you have really taken on this work of dissemination and of creating spaces for your voices, and for other voices that maybe aren't being reflected by treatment, by the clinicians, by the media surrounding eating disorders and eating disorder treatment. And Jayden, I'll ask you this first, but for everybody, I'm wondering how this sort of process of storytelling, and also of actively disseminating and creating communities and creating language, has been instrumental in your own healing.
Yeah, there's so much power in telling your own story in a way that makes sense to you. And I guess I can speak for myself. When I started doing that and creating these spaces for TFED, it was so much healing to just be in spaces with other people who are trans or gender nonconforming, who understand the complexities of existing in a body where there's both dysphoria and dysmorphia, and being able to share those unique stories. And even in creating that space, hearing other stories reflected back to me, it's like, oh, like, okay, like I'm not alone in this. I'm really not alone in this, and we can collectively heal. I think that's really, collective healing is really important, and I think that's the power of storytelling and sharing your story and a space, and providing more spaces for other folks to share their stories. There becomes this opportunity for collective healing, which I think is really important in marginalized communities where that's prior to being colonized, that was a lot of the ways that healing happened. Um, so yeah, there's this healing, and there's this beauty and power in the collective healing once you're able to share stories amongst your community. And then also the visibility part as well. I think it's when I've seen people that look like me existing in the world, it's like, oh, okay, I can exist and also share my story too. So that, for the little black, queer, gender fluid kid growing up in the hood that's like, I don't know, I think I might have an eating disorder, I feel like if they can see my story, there can be some healing for them. And hopefully it can happen younger than it happened for me. Or that process to recovery can start younger.
So I guess, what I'm then curious about, and Malin, I'll ask you this to start with, is how, sort of thinking from the other side for clinicians, what's the importance for clinicians to be able to hear stories, and to be able to facilitate opportunities for storytelling in this way?
I think as a clinician, one of the things that I wanted to hear is the story, to have the big picture of the situation, because it's not only giving you the information about the struggles, but also about the strengths of the patient. I remember one of the first patient that I treated here, that I used a conceptualized clinical case and used like a graphic, put together all of the pieces that the patient gave me through the first 3 sessions about her story. And using that graphic, putting together all of the pieces of her life, I remember when I discussed that graphic with her, was like for her, oh my God, this is the first time in my life that I am seeing all of the pieces of my life together. So that gave us like a big picture about her life, and not only focusing on the struggle, but for me it was very important to focus on the strengths, because that was the way to move her from the victim to a survivor, and recognize all of her strengths her capacity to go through a lot of stuff on her life. So I think that that was the moment that for me was so clear that we need to have the whole story of the person, and have that picture could help not only to the patient but also for us as a clinician to understand what is going on with this person and how we can work together to go through the recovery process.
Yeah,
And
I
so,
just wanted to add, sorry. I think it's so important that you did that because, like you were saying, highlighting the strengths too. And, people don't exist as monolithic identities. We hold multiple identities, all of us. And for marginalized communities, multiple oppressed identities, and all of those oppressions working at the same time. And it's important, I think, for clinicians to get that entire picture in order to be able to provide competent care.
I agree. I think also the medical field has changed so much. Your family doctor used to sit down and ask you about all aspects of your life. How's your marriage? How's school? How's this? And um, the medical industry has become so almost like fast food. You go in, you go out. There's no time to actually have people tell their stories. And I think the field of narrative medicine is trying to get more clinicians to get to know the narratives of their patients so we can treat patients holistically, which is really the only path to healing. And well, actually, until we can have doctors that are concerned and care about the stories, we need to share our stories with each other and provide that that space for healing.
okay. And so, we're talking about building these opportunities to share our stories, so our clinicians, our doctors can know us better, so our peers can know us better, so we can co-create language. At the same time, there's always an inherent risk in sharing our stories. And so, Pia, I'll ask you this first, but have you ever encountered a negative reaction sharing your story? What was that like, and how did you keep on?
I've encountered a lot of denial from people that just don't know. And so I think part of it's very hurtful, it's invalidating, but I think it takes courage to share your story. And it's almost taking on sharing your story and finding the audience that it resonates with is one of the most empowering, healing things that I have experienced in my life, is knowing that my story can actually resonate and help heal someone else, or help them go onto the path of healing, or just make them not feel as isolated or alone or stigmatized. That's why I keep sharing my story. I mean, as I just shared before, I still get invalidation from some of my closest family members. But there's so many people I have been able to connect with and share common experiences, and where their stories empower me and I can empower them. And so I think it's transformative. Sharing our stories is transformative. And I think the advice I would give is to just keep sharing, and that there will be people that deny your basic experience or even deny your existence, and to just keep mustering the courage, keep creating community to share. And because for me, it's been why I have healed.
when I give workshops with kids or teens, I let them know of the importance of talking about if they're having signs of an eating disorder or body image issues. I let them know to go speak to someone. And if that person doesn't do anything, they can go to the next person. And the truth is that the subject of eating disorders, especially in marginalized communities, is like a hot potato. Nobody wants to be dealing with it, so they just throw it around. And in reality, there isn't information, accessible information for people to know what to say and do when someone opens up and says, hey, I think I'm struggling with food. People don't know how to react. So that's why it's kind of like that hot potato. So again, I tell youth the importance of continuing to share the story, even if they get their stories get minimized or get dismissed. And also, I let them know that they're their own best advocate and that they need to stand up for themselves. And I think that that's one big thing that we don't do with youth, is that to tell them that they need to be their own best advocate, especially when it comes to the medical industrial complex, because many times we have to be talking with professionals who tell us that no, our eating disorders, we don't have an eating disorder because that only happens to white people. Like, I've had friends who have had that experience with professionals, or dealing with family members who don't know what to say or do, right? So we have to teach young people and all people that they need to be their own best advocates when it comes to navigating, um, society and professional help.
I think also when it comes to, like Gloria was saying, navigating the medical industrial complex, there's this assumption that is made by these professionals that they know what you need. A common thing for trans folks, at least, is like transition as the cure for everything. Once someone goes through whatever transition they need to go through, and in the medical industrial complex, they often assume that everyone wants the same medical transition, which is not true. Then everything will be fine. But there isn't, like we were talking about before, listening to the entire narrative that really needs to happen. And also, like Gloria was saying, there's really a need for folks to be their own advocates. The medical industrial complex, when it comes to marginalized communities, is often treated us as disposable kinds of beings, often the kinds of folks who were experimented on and the kinds of folks who weren't seen as valuable bodies. So there's definitely just a strong need to self-advocate as a person who exists in a marginalized community, because the medical industrial complex makes assumptions about what you really need. So yeah, I think that's what really has propelled me to continue to tell my story when I'm navigating the medical industrial complex. But then also outside of that, within the communities, within the Black community, I've gotten like, don't let like we have to keep it within the community kind of things. Like, why are you letting everyone know what's going on with us? Kind of speaking to what you were saying earlier, Pia, about like with keeping things within the family. We don't want to look bad, and because there's so much pressure to combat the stereotypes that people have about specific. I can speak to just the Black community. That be twice as good, be twice as good, and be better. Don't fit that stereotype. There's been a lot of pushback for being open about things like mental health and mental illness and eating disorders, because it's like, we're not supposed to let those folks, other people, know that we struggle with this. Like, why are you putting your business out there? And I think it's really important, though, to continue to highlight the power in owning, at least for myself, owning my own story, and for think about the other folks who need to know that it's, seriously, someone else who is experiencing this, you're not alone. And I think that's what really pushes me to continue to tell my story is there's someone out there that needs to know they're not alone.
And so I want to ask all of you, what do you think are next steps? And for people who may be out there listening to this and feeling like, well, but I am alone. I don't know where to go to hear people's stories. Are there places where you might send them? Resources that you would recommend?
I think all of us can share our own, what the projects we're working on. People can come to our website at adiosbarbie.com. I also like Proud to Be Me, which is through NIDA. And I love also the resources that Gloria and Jayden groups provide, which I'd love to hear about.
I always recommend The Body's Not an Apology. They post amazing intersectional articles on body image, eating disorders, political issues, and radical self-love. So I always send people their way to The Body's Not an Apology, and they're very active in social media. Another source where I always send people and I'm always talking about is this book. Luckily I had it with me, A Hunger So Wide and So Deep by Becky Thompson. And I always share with people that I truly believe that this is the book that saved my life. And MPP, Laguna Positivity Pride, started because of this book, right? And I always send people this way. Unfortunately, there's not enough research on people of color and eating disorders, and there's very, very few books that talk about the subject, and this is one of them. It's 1 out of 3 books out there that I know of. So I always send people to this book, and obviously, Laguna Positivity Pride, which is a Chicana Brown Indigenous body positive and eating disorder awareness project of mine, and check out what we offer. And we're in the process of creating one of the first body positive support spaces for teens of color in Los Angeles, and much more. So check out our site. We're also active in social media.
I'm so glad you mentioned The Body's Not an Apology. It's amazing. Also, TFED is all over social media, trans folks fighting eating disorders, folks with an X. And we have a Facebook support group. It's a closed group for trans and gender nonconforming identified people. That is a really great sort of venting space to sort of like immediately get some stuff out. We're also in the process of transitioning to having an online support group or virtual support group that's a little bit more structured. We're locally starting to work out having some family meals for folks in the LA area, because we know that for communities of color, family meals were often a really important thing, and for trans and non-conforming folks, a lot of us can't access our families of origin because they don't want us anymore because of our identities. So being able to still access that family meal, but with your community or your chosen family is really important. So we're in the process of working that out. Check us out on all the social media sites. Our Tumblr is really great for youth who are looking for resources that way as well.
So I wanted to add that as a clinician, I am very grateful for people like you that have the courage to share your story with us. I think that not everybody can do that, and so thanks for do that for those who can share their story because maybe they are so ashamed because the stigma. So I think that is very powerful that you can share your story with all of us. Um, we have the fotonovelas available in our web page at UNC, Eating Disorder Clinic. Um, we still need more information in Spanish. I think that there are a group of Latinos monolingual here, and we don't have the variety information that they need in order to know what to do, where to go, and we need to continue working on developing more information on Spanish. I know that Nida is working so hard translating all of the information in Spanish, which is good. So I think that this is a population that we need to continue working with.
All right, well, I think that this brings us to the end of this hangout. So thank you very, very much to all of our just incredible, inspiring panelists here. I'm deeply appreciative to have been able to be a part of this. I feel like I've learned so much. And for those of you who are watching this, to learn more about the Marginalized Voices Project, please do click on the link that is in this video's description. And thank you all.